thank you everyone who's here for joining us today. Welcome to this webinar, which is about COVID funding and the R&D tax relief claim scheme with Jen Badger and Ian Cashin, who are joining us here, our in-house R&D tax experts. I'm Suze, I'll be your compere for today. Our monthly webinars usually focus on eligibility within topical sectors. Today, however, we are looking at how the government's much needed help to businesses throughout the pandemic may impact your clients' R&D claims. We'll be covering CBILS, business bounce back loans, furlough, and much more. Why is this important? Well, confusion has arisen for several reasons, with some funding being called loans, therefore not immediately identifiable as a grant or subsidy. Some of the funding available is notified state aid and some is not, and some of the information provided by HMRC is not necessarily that easy to understand. So what is the actual problem? Well, the lack of clarity has meant that not everyone is entirely clear on how these various types of funding will affect their clients' ability to claim for SME R&D tax relief, and as a result, may lead to them inadvertently breaching the rules. Jen and Ian will try to unpack some of this for you today, and we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A a bit later on. Just before we jump in, a quick intro to anybody joining us today who doesn't already know who we are. We are WhisperClaims, the only fully automated claims preparation and report writing software designed for accountants to deliver R&D tax claims quickly and easily in-house with no need to outsource. We have over 150 firms with over 400 users within those firms across the UK already using our technology to provide R&D tax services to their clients, supplemented by our comprehensive range of support and advice. I'll be telling you a bit later on how you can find out more if you're interested. So back to the main event. As already mentioned, we're going to have the usual Q&A session at the end, so please get your questions ready and start firing them over in preparation for later on. Just a bit of housekeeping, you can see on the slide there in front of you. If you would like to chat to us, please have your chat box open and settings switched to 2 panelists. And if you want to chat to us and the audience as well, make sure you toggle your settings accordingly. If you do have any questions, just so that we can make sure that we answer them in the right flow, please do use the Q&A box. And if you want to ask a question anonymously, again, you can toggle your settings to ensure that you can do that. So without further ado, let's hand over to Jen and Ian.
Hey everyone, sorry, we're all a little bit harassed after a somewhat stressful moment on our way in, but we're all okay now. So as he says, we're going to address all the different types of funding that the government have made available through the coronavirus crisis for companies. But what I wanted to say first is what we get a lot when we talk about this kind of thing. Sorry, can't get my slides to move. So outline is obviously we'll talk about all the different types of funding. What I wanted to say first, though, is this is something we say every time, is there's kind of sometimes a lack of understanding about what acceptance of a claim means in the context of SME and SME R&D tax relief, or in fact RDEC tax relief. There's no such thing really as a claim being accepted. HMRC is unlikely to actually read and check every claim in detail. The process really is that the tax returns are processed, claims are paid out, and then HMRC will ask questions about a subset of those. So really, especially in the context of the kind of coronavirus reliefs that fundings that have been made available, obviously some of those claims will have gone through and been accepted, for want of a better word, but possibly not looked at. So if what we're saying now contradicts things that you have done, it doesn't necessarily mean either was wrong. It's purely that HMRC may not have looked at that claim in detail yet. So as I say, all you can ever say is that HMRC hasn't looked at it yet, and it's best to err on the side of caution, especially when it comes to these slightly confusing area of reliefs. Anyway, jumping in, the first thing we're going to talk about is the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, or Furlough. So what I've done first is I've pulled out what HMRC says in the guidance for the R&D tax relief scheme. And when I pulled it out yesterday, I realized that actually it could be a little bit contradictory. So the first thing they say is the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme is not a notified state aid. So when furlough payments are met by the government through the CJRS, the notified state aid rules are not in point. Okay, it's fine, not a state aid. Reading further down, However, to the extent that furlough payments are met by the government through CJRS, the general subsidy rules do apply, meaning that expenditure has to be treated as having been subsidised and will therefore not qualify for relief within the SME scheme. So those points appear to contradict each other, but actually, when you read further down, what you realise is it doesn't really matter, because what HMRC say is, as the furloughed employees have ceased all work during the CJRS period, HMRC considers these employees cannot be regarded as having directly or actively engaged in relevant research and development during these times. So what does that actually mean? What it means is, they would count as a subsidy, and you would have to put the amount that you were given for furlough through RDEC, for example, if you were claiming for that project. But because furlough workers, by definition, can't have been actively engaged in R&D during the time they were furloughed, it doesn't matter. What you have to do is exclude the amount of furlough payments received before you make the claim. So it doesn't push projects into RDEC out of SME. It doesn't affect which way you can claim, doesn't affect the amount you can claim, except that you cannot claim for any of those payments. So so you've got to exclude. So if a worker is furloughed for the entire financial year, then you wouldn't be able to include them at all. If they were part furloughed, part working on R&D, that's where things get a little bit complicated. So we've when we've talking to clients, and I know Ian's been looking at this as well with his clients, there's essentially two ways of doing this, of excluding that furlough time. You can either take out all the furlough costs completely and then apportion your staff as you normally would. So if you had someone who spent 6 months on furlough, 6 months working on R&D, and they were normally spending 50% of their time on R&D, you could purely put in the payments made at the time they were actually working and apportion it to 50% as usual. Or if you want to include those payments, if there's difficulty of separating out from payroll which were furlough and which were not, you can include all of the furlough payments in those staff costs, but then apportion it appropriately. So if you've got the same staff member who spent 6 months on furlough and 6 months working on R&D and spent 50% of their time on R&D for the time they were working, you'd apportion them as 25% if you included their furlough payments. So to kind of sum up the furlough stuff, it doesn't affect which scheme you're claiming through. You can still claim through SME if the company can claim through SME. You just have to make sure you're excluding those payments from the government one way or the other, and making sure you're not including time for anyone that's on furlough, because, as I say, by definition, they cannot have been working on R&D during that time. I'm now going to pass over to Ian to pick up the next thing, which is the CJRS and BBLS stuff.
Thanks, Jen. Just because the technical difficulties earlier on, you can hear me, yeah?
Yeah.
Great. Hi, everyone. Similar to the furlough scheme, the loan schemes have been very well received by everybody. The take-up has been huge, and I'm sure everyone on this call has at least one client who has taken furlough or a BBLS and CBILS. But they're slightly different to furlough insofar as whilst furlough is reasonably straightforward, the loan schemes are not. So they are all notified state aid. Okay, so that means under the Corporation Tax Act, it could potentially prevent a claim going through as SME relief. But HMRC would only expect this to happen where the loan relates particularly to the company's expenditure incurred on R&D, rather than just providing general support. So how does that look? We move on to the next. The effects are straightforward. Any amount of the loan scheme that's included in a project will turn that entire project from being an SME claim potentially to an RDEC claim. So it could go from a 30% benefit to an SME company to a 10%. But like everything with research and development tax relief, the devil is quite in the detail, and proving whether the loans have been used for R&D is the difficult part. So over the last probably 12 months now, since they first started kind of really hitting the books, I've had numerous conversations with clients of my own as to how they would go about applying for these loans, and how they would impact on their R&D claim going forward. So it is just about kind of keeping a bit of a paper trail. So things that I would say to think about when you're assessing the effect of these loans are, did you intend to use this loan to fund an R&D project? If you did, it will just have to be sucked up and said, yeah, it's got to go through RDEC because you funded a project specifically through a notified state aid. What we did in the past, and I know Jen is going to tell me off for saying this because no claim is accepted. They just haven't asked you any questions about it yet. But we, very early on in the game, were of the mindset that if you were applying for a business interruption loan scheme or a bounce back loan scheme, that if you were to state in your application that it was specifically was not for R&D, then you've got a pretty good basis to be able to say, this shouldn't affect my R&D claim, and therefore, if it's qualifying, you should be able to put it through as an SME claim. Another thing to consider is, like, before you got the loan, was R&D already being carried out? So did it really have an impact on the actual claim itself? And if you've put it into a separate bank account, have you touched that money yet? I've heard anecdotes about companies having returned it, having never used the money at all. And they're all good indicators that, the claim would not necessarily go through or would have to go through as an RDEC. It could go through as an SME. Next slide. So recovery loan scheme is slightly different again. Yes, technically a notified state aid, but HMRC don't believe that any of these loans will have any effect on subsequent claims for R&D, both in the SME or the RDEC scheme. However, and this is something that I'm still researching at the moment. I spent about 2 hours last night and an hour and a half this morning trying to dig down through section 11381A of the Corporation Tax Act to understand, a bit like everything with Brexit, the Northern Ireland Protocol it's got its own little nuances to everything. So at this moment in time, how this will affect companies in Northern Ireland is a little bit up in the air. My thoughts on it at the moment is that it will affect them. They will still be affected as a notified state aid and therefore won't be able to claim under SME. But yeah, it's just my best advice really with that is, if you are making a claim for a company with a premises in Northern Ireland or based in Northern Ireland or doing their R&D in Northern Ireland, that you probably would be best to speak to HMRC, to one of the R&D teams before you actually make a claim on that.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Ian. Cool. So that's covered off furlough and the loan schemes. So the sort of final loan scheme related to coronavirus that came out over the past couple of years is the future fund loans. So this is where the government would loan money to a company if they could get matched investment from an external investor. These are super straightforward. HMRC basically say they're not notified state aid and they wouldn't need to be looked at all. So they wouldn't affect the R&D claim at all. So these would be treated as any other loan a company would be given and doesn't touch the R&D. So we don't really need to say any more about that. Future fund loans for once, no effect, no worries. Sort of final funding that the government made available was all these different local authority grants. So digging into this as I was preparing for this webinar, I thought there were fewer than this, but actually it's been 6 different ones we made available during the crisis. They are grants, so you would treat them the way you would any other grant with an R&D claim. So you'd look at, was the grant money used for R&D and was it state aid or de minimis? And therefore either, obviously if it's state aid and it's used in an R&D project, you'd push the cost of that project through the RDEC scheme. If it's non-notified or de minimis state aid, then you'd only put in the amount of the grant that was used for R&D through RDEC, and everything else could go through SME. So as I say, the rules would be exactly the same. The complication here is around actually which ones are notified and which ones are de minimis. And also some of them are affected by whether they were received pre-Brexit, so pre-31st December 2020 or after the 1st of January 2021. Is that right? Whatever the date was for Brexit. Whichever side of it they were received will affect whether they affect your SME status or not. So just to go through that list. The most recent one that's come out was the Additional Restriction Support Grants, so ARG. If that was received pre-January 2021, then it's a notified state aid grant and you'd have to treat it as a notified state aid grant. So as I say, if the company that you're working with received an ARG, then and used it for R&D, if it was taken before Brexit, then that would push their R&D projects through RDEC, not through SME. Post January 2021, it would come under the same state aid rules as the recovery loans. So that's where it wouldn't be treated as state aid, theoretically, unless the company is subject to Northern Ireland Protocol. So back in that kind of quite complicated situation around Northern Ireland Protocol, does it apply, and therefore do you have to use the state aid rules? It would still count as a subsidy, as far as I can tell. And again, this is something that's not entirely clear. None of these things are mentioned in the CIRD directly. But obviously, if a company has received money like this that looks like a subsidy and used it for R&D, you treat it as a subsidy. So therefore, you take the amount of that and put it through RDEC, but everything else in the project will go through SME. So you're still going to have to consider it, but you just need to think about when it was received and whether it's a state aid or you could treat it as essentially as a de minimis grant. The restart grants, again, came out fairly recently. And in this one, the state aid rules are exactly, so these were post-Brexit grants. So again, you treat it exactly as I just described for the same as a recovery loan. So again, it would be treated as a subsidy if it was spent on R&D, unless the company is subject to Northern Ireland Protocol. I think we're going to be tired of saying the phrase Northern Ireland Protocol by the end of this webinar, but it's becoming more and more important, especially
reading it, so.
but especially with this kind of almost transition period between some grants that have come before and some after. We've got to be really careful about whether they're subject to that. We've also got local restriction support grants and Christmas support payments. So again, they are very similar to the ARG. So again, if it came out pre-Brexit, treat it as a notified state aid. Post-Brexit, it would be a subsidy unless the company is in Northern Ireland, in which case it'd be a notified state aid. So as I say, they seem straightforward until you dig into them. So it's really, really important to understand which type of grant your client had and when they received it to know what to do with it. Happily, the last three are a lot more straightforward. So those were the Small Business Grant Fund, the Retail, Hospitality and Leisure Business Grant Fund, and the Local Authority Discretionary Grants Fund. So these are all the ones that came out very, very early. They were kind of April, May 2020. They're all de minimis state aid. So for these ones, so they're pre-Brexit, so we don't need to worry about the Northern Ireland Protocol issues. They're de minimis state aid. So that means if any of that grant was used for R&D, only the amount of the grant that was used on R&D will go through RDEC. Everything else could continue to go through SME. I think that's all there is to say on those, really. But as I say, it's so, so important to make sure you know when your company received the grant and which one it took. These ones have all closed now, so there shouldn't be as much ambiguity. Some of them are still available for to be applied for at the moment. Before we kind of open this up to questions, I realize we've kind of romped through quite a lot of information quite quickly. So obviously questions are very welcome. The key thing with any of this and any claim at all is just make sure you're comfortable with it. So you're comfortable with the way you've treated the grant, you're comfortable with the way you've treated the loans, you've asked all the right questions, you know where the money went, where the money is now, anything like that. You've asked those questions. And in my usual warning, also, if it doesn't fit HMRC's criteria and they can't produce a competent professional, just don't make the claim. But especially with the COVID funding, just make sure you and your client feel comfortable that you've treated it in the right way. Okay, so I'm just going to pass back to Suze before we leap into the questions.
Okay, just a couple of reminders for everyone. I know everyone will be dying to get into questions. I can already see a couple there. So the slide that you can see in front of you is just advertising our 2 monthly training courses for October and November, the fundamentals course and the identifying eligibility course. Links to our events and courses page will be in the chat box in a moment. Places are limited to keep the groups tight and interactive, so be sure to book swiftly if you are interested. This is just a reminder to our subscribers and anyone who is on trial that you can take advantage of our new client review service that's headed up by Ian. I'll also pop a link to our support page in the chat box as well, which has more info about all of the support we provide, as well as the new client review service as well. Also a shout out to our WhisperClaims subscriber community. Our WhatsApp group is being migrated over to our Facebook group, so do look out for our comms via email. And finally, if anybody joining us today is interested in seeing a demo of WhisperClaims, my contact details will also be in the chat box, as well as links to our book a demo page. So please do feel free to get in touch there as well. Okay, so over to questions. I think I've got one sitting there ready to go. So does SEIS or EIS investments affect a company's R&D claim?
They can do. I always get these mixed up. What I want to say, it's SEIS is de minimis and EIS is notified state aid, I want to say. So the same rules around de minimis aid and notified state aid would apply to whichever one of those you're referring to. Yeah, but it's about whether those aids were used in a particular project, or if it was just an overall EIS scheme that you're on. Anything to add, Jen?
No, I was very hopeful that you would know more about that than I do. And you did. So
I hope I've got them the right way around. I want to say SEIS is de minimis and EIS is.
You're a great, someone in the chat has given the same opinion. So.
Okay.
Thank you for that. Okay, that's great. Brilliant. Thank you. Just to anyone who's asking for copies of the slides afterwards, I've got a couple of anonymous people asking. So obviously I would need your email addresses. So I'm just going to pop my details in the chat box in a moment. So if anybody wants to get in touch, please do so afterwards. Okay, I've got another question here. Can it be said then that as long as any grant funding of whatever kind has not been spent on R&D, then it can be ignored for the SME scheme?
So the direct answer to this is yes, you're right. So if it's not been spent on R&D, you can ignore it. What I always recommend, though, is that you declare how much grant funding has been received in the claim year in any documentations that you're sending to HMRC. So whatever you're producing to support the claim, you declare that grant funding and then say that none of it was used for R&D. If you say that no grant funding was received and HMRC can see, so they're looking at the claim and it says no grant funding was received, and they're looking at the accounts and they say 10 grand of funding was received, you're inviting a question. Like, you're very much inviting a question from HMRC as to where did that grant funding go? So absolutely, yes, you can ignore it. I think I would include it just to make sure that you're not inviting an immediate question from HMRC about, well, okay, you had a grant, did it get spent on R&D?
I agree.
Okay. Just got some more questions about recordings, and then thanks, Karen Evans, one of our subscribers, has mentioned that the software prompts you really well in terms of how to deal with grants with confidence. So thanks, Karen. That's great feedback. Actually, the rest of the questions are more related to recordings. So does anybody else have any questions for us today? I know we've covered quite a lot of information. There's quite a lot to take in. Does anybody have any specific scenarios that they would like some help or advice with from the panel here?
One thing we had been discussing in the context of this, which we don't actually know the answer to, but I think it's a good thing to point out, is one thing that's unclear. So with normal grant funding and R&D tax relief, there's a definite endpoint to the project, the funding, all that kind of thing. And so it's very, very easy to say, this project was grant funded, this project started after the grant finished, and therefore is not affected by the loan or the grant, sorry. What's still a bit ambiguous is if with all these loans, at what point it stops affecting things. So is it when the loan is paid? Is it when the loan is paid back? Is it, there's that ambiguity, and it's something that we'll kind of keep pushing out whatever we can get as to how it's going to affect things. But just to bear in mind that technically speaking, according to the guidance, if the project receives any state aid funding at any point in its life cycle, that project should go through RDEC for the rest of its life. So even if you spent a small amount of CBILS loans now to keep it going, and then 3 years' time, the same project is still running, if it was a normal grant, the rules would say that should still go through RDEC. So it's just something to bear in mind, is to kind of, even moving to the future when the loans have been paid back or they've spent it all, there might still be an effect. We're just not sure how HMRC is going to treat that at the moment.
Yeah, just to add to that as well, COVID funding and COVID grants aside, as an advisor, if you know your client is looking for grants and they do R&D, it's worth having a conversation with them as well before they start applying for grants, because one, it's quite a long drawn out process to apply for most type of, say, regional development fund or Horizon 2020 grants, those type of things. It's a very long drawn out process, but also you very rarely will get the full funding that you're looking for. And when that funding is done, your project could continue on for months and months, potentially years after your funding has finished. Whereas, and that will put the claim into the RDEC pot then. Whereas if you were to look at it and say, okay, if we have the cash flow to be able to continue and put it through the SME scheme, we can claim back money or reduce our tax bill on an annual basis until the project is actually finished in its entirety in the SME scheme, which, as we all know, is far more beneficial for the SME.
Cool. Okay, so I've got a couple in the chat box. If anybody's asking questions, please can I ask you to pop them in the Q&A box. It just helps us with the flow a bit easier, but I'll go to these just now. So Ian, thank you for your question. What happens if employers' allowance is claimed and furlough is claimed at the same time?
Well, technically, as we mentioned a little while ago, those on furlough cannot, by definition, be taking part in any R&D activities, so their costs would actually be ineligible. Employers' allowance, you can still claim, and a portion of the salary costs relatable to the employer allowance will go through as an RDEC amount, but not the whole project.
Yeah, I don't have much to add other than, obviously, I'm not sure if there's any issues around that out with the context of R&D. It's kind of outside of my knowledge, but as Ian says, yeah, they'll, as long as you're excluding the furlough payments, there shouldn't be an issue.
Great. Okay, another one from the chat box. Going back to the EIS funding, the investment received was for a startup, so generic funding for the growth of the business. Some of it may have been used for R&D, though not a lot. The SEIS de minimis was entirely used for the R&D work. So does that mean most of the claim can go through SME, but some of it will need to go through RDEC?
It's difficult without seeing how the... I would say the answer to that is potentially yes. I would think, because the de minimis amount would be just the de minimis amount. I mean, you would need to be able to say that the EIS was categorically used for the R&D projects. If it was just an overall EIS, then it's used for many, many different things. But you could argue the case that it wasn't used in the R&D project at all in that sense, but it's really difficult without knowing the exact case you're talking about.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is say that the way that this is actually applied is more on a project by project basis. So again, it could be that if the EIS was used for one project and the SEIS was used for all of the others, then that one that the EIS was used for would go through RDEC, and then the ones the SEIS was used for could go through SME, with the SEIS portion going through RDEC. So it would be quite a complicated claim, and you need to work through kind of, were they separate projects and where did the funding go? So as Ian says, you'd need to kind of really be able to sit down with a bit of paper and sketch it all out to really, for us to be able to give a really definitive answer on that one.
Great, thanks guys. Okay, I've got a ton of new questions coming in. Thanks everyone. Okay, so on the road to post-COVID recovery and beyond, is there a general view that Parliament wishes to expand R&D tax credits further as a way to boost the economy? Quite a broad one there.
Yes and no. I mean, so a lot of the kind of chat we've seen in a lot of the consultations that come out recently have been around things like expanding the scheme to allow cloud computing costs, for example. So allowing companies to claim for different costs, things like broadband, which at the moment is excluded, but obviously is very, very key to the running of every company now. Our Wi-Fi went down the other day and we all just had to go home. So it's incredibly important, obviously, to anything we do these days. So there's a lot of, I say, consultations chat about expanding what costs could be included. There's also been some chat about expanding the scheme to actually move more into the social science things. So allowing political or economic research, for example, to be included, but I'm not sure that's where that is kind of in the legislative pipeline. At the same time, there was a consultation done that ended in June that was more around actually not reducing the scheme, but better policing of the scheme, what people would like to see. Do people want to see it being more strongly regulated? What kind of training do they want to see? All that kind of thing. So I suppose on one hand, the government does seem to be looking to potentially expand how much can be claimed and what kind of projects you can claim for. But on the other hand, they are looking to, I think, police it better, and potentially do things like increase the number of inquiries and make sure that everybody's kind of obeying the legislation the way they should.
Yeah, their investment in, the additional new R&D staff by HMRC, is evidence that yes, they will police it more. The introduction of the CT 600L to prevent fraud, yes, is another benefit. But a couple of years ago, when we first heard of the B word, I think a lot of people in the R&D world were very concerned that post us leaving the EU, that this was going to stop, because at the end of the day, was technically EU money. So the fact that the first kind of budget statement post Brexit, where they didn't reduce the costs or the benefits, I think is only to be looked at as a positive, really. So yeah, I don't think they'll bring it back, but I think they'll keep it going, I think.
Thanks, guys. Okay, next question. This is a good one. If grant funding goes into a general bank account, how can you prove that it was or was not what it was or was not spent on?
And the quick answer to this as well,
you can't.
It's very difficult. You can't. The problem here, and the key issue in all of this, is that normally a grant is applied for in a very specific way, that you've got to do loads of paperwork that describes exactly what you're going to spend the grant funding on, and then you have to prove that you spent the grant money on those things. So you're getting that grant money, and so it's very, very easy if HMRC were to sit with your claim and the grant documentation to be able to see exactly what you should have spent it on, and therefore which projects were affected. The problem with these loans is they're not given out for anything specific. So actually, it's very difficult to prove one way or the other if the grant was used. So it's something we don't know. We haven't really seen HMRC asking questions about this yet. We haven't seen much pushback. So it's hard to know how HMRC are going to police this and what kind of proof they're going to ask for if they do. I mean, as I say, if HMRC could show that R&D projects were ongoing and there wasn't enough money in the company bank account to cover the cost of the R&D, then clearly they're going to say, well, the grant must have been spent on this because you didn't have any other money. If the grant's sitting there and you've got loads of other cash and the company definitely didn't spend it on the R&D, then it would be really hard for HMRC to prove it. So as I say, we can't say for definite because we haven't seen many of these claims wash through yet. We haven't seen many inquiries come through yet for claims where CBILS or BBLS was received. So we'll keep you updated. But yeah, the answer is it's difficult either way.
Yeah, and as you mentioned earlier on, Jen, as well, it's best just to disclose these things because they know about it in the background. So if you're hiding the fact that they've received a grant, then they'll know about it, and it will bring the rest of the claim into a slight disrepute in that sense. And as Karen mentioned, and I think was it Karen mentioned earlier on the Q&A, our system will tell you to enter the amount, and then it will ask you to then can you apportion it to what you spent in that. So it's a bit of a no-brainer in that sense.
Great. Okay, next question. Sorry, I'll just make sure that I'm trying to get this across properly. If a subsidiary company is carrying out R&D and the holding company or another subsidiary received a grant, will it affect it anyway? I think that's what you're trying to say, Gaurav.
No. So from an R&D point of view, subsidiary companies, holding companies are treated, obviously they're connected, and it affects things like whether you're treated as an SME or a large company, but they're still separate legal entities. So as long as the legal entity doing the R&D, carrying it out and paying for it and all that kind of thing didn't receive the grant, and it was some other legal entity, whether it's a subsidiary of the holding company, it shouldn't affect the ability of that company doing the R&D to claim R&D tax relief.
Okay, next one. De minimis state aid has a 200k limit over 3 years. Does the R&D claim eat into this?
So
Yeah.
And the answer is no if it's an SME tax relief claim, because that is notified state aid. So it's not a de minimis state aid, it's a notified state aid, which is a different thing. So it doesn't eat into that a little bit. I'm now racking my brains to remember what the rules are around RDEC, and I think the answer for that is no as well. Do you know about that, Ian?
Off the top of my head, no. I'm not gonna lie.
But definitely not for the SME tax relief scheme, because it's not a de minimis state aid.
Okay. Okay. Next, how is it decided whether a grant is considered de minimis or state aid?
That's a really good question. Somebody in government makes that call on that, I'm afraid. I've got no idea. I can't decipher either.
So from what I could tell, so when I was looking into all of the grants this time last year, it's essentially, before Brexit, it was a decision made by the European Commission. So any money that a government wants to give out would have to go to the European Commission to be kind of rubber stamped, and they would decide whether it's de minimis or state aid. So yeah, it's set by the person that's giving out the money, and it's set early on in the process. So I would always say with grants and things, it's usually in the letter. There's usually something in the T's and C's around state aid. And I was looking online yesterday, obviously, for all these different fundings that we've talked about today, and they all do state on government websites what the rules are around state aid. There's kind of PDFs about each one that gives you all this information about whether it's de minimis and the rules around things like the Northern Ireland Protocol and all that kind of thing. So the information is generally there in the T's and C's in some way.
Okay. Ian's just mentioned there the de minimis is 200k euros over 3 years, but it does depend on the sector, apparently.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question. If a project was EU grant funded in 2018, but the project did not start until 1920 year, and only a small amount of the funding grant amount is shown on the annual accounts, and the client is wishing to do a claim for the period 1920, do you use all of the grant amounts or just the amount shown on the annual accounts?
Just the amount in the accounts.
Yeah, that's what I would always put in. Yeah, just the amount that's received that year. But obviously you'll then reflect it every year that the grant funding is received. You'll reflect the amount received in that year.
Okay. And another question from Jeremy. Some of our R&D claiming clients received 10k funding called Coronavirus Business Support Grant Scheme. Which of your categories of local authority grants per your slides does this fall into?
I'm going to make the assumptions because I think different local authorities called them slightly different things. If those were the ones early on, they were the sort of set 10k grants that the local authorities give out. They are de minimis. So they're the kind of small business grants. They're the same as the hospitality grants. So those are a de minimis grant given out early on.
Thank you. And another question from Simon in the chat box. If a company claims a bounce back loan and £100 of this is spent on R&D expenditure, does this mean that the whole project has to go through RDEC?
Technically speaking, yeah. It would be really, really silly to put 100 quids, you know what I mean, you know, in the greater scheme of things, that's bad financial planning, really. But technically speaking, yes.
Yeah, we've always said like even 1 penny of state aid spent on a project pushes it all into RDEC. It's just the rules. There's nothing you can do. We do have I did a little interesting little exercise last year sometime, and there's a blog on our website to show that there's a tipping point in terms of state aid funding and what you spend on your projects that's actually quite high, so a lot of the time it's not worth using state aid on R&D unless it's a massive amount of state aid, because the difference in sort of return between being able to claim SME tax relief and using the grant, you've got to be taking out quite a big grant or using a lot of the loan to make it worthwhile.
Yeah.
Brilliant. That's us managed to get through all of the questions. There was loads. Thanks, everyone. Does anybody have any more? We've got a couple more minutes. If anybody has anything else that they want to fire at Jenna in, please do let us know. Just give you all 30 seconds to type if you are. No, I think that was everything. Okay, well, I guess if nobody else has anything that they want to ask, guys, are you okay for us to draw this to a close for today?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone who's saying thank you, and Karen and Ian. Just to say thank you to everyone for all of your time today, as always. And if anybody does have any questions following the session, please get in touch with us. As always, we're really keen to hear any feedback, and also have any inputs into subjects or topics that you'd like to hear us discuss. Please do let us know. Thank you, everyone who's saying thank you too. Have a great rest of your week, guys, and we'll see you all soon. Take care.